Hello, and welcome to the Emancipated Citizen Podcast, where two human rights activists bring to you the stories of some of the bravest men and women out there fighting against authoritarianism for their freedom and individuality. I am Zach Reyes.
I'm Benjamin Snow.
Today, we are going to talk to somebody who I have wanted to talk to in this context for quite a while. Things haven't quite worked out, and I'm very happy to have her here now. She is a feminist icon in the Islamic-dominated world, Muslim, ex-Muslim women. She's very outspoken about women's rights in Islamic societies. She is also very outspoken about the rights and struggles of ex-Muslims around the world. Zara Kay, welcome. Would you like to expound on my very short introduction here and tell us more about yourself and your work for a start?
I guess I just want to add that I was outspoken. I think I've been a bit more quiet since Tanzania, but also kind of rebuilding my life. But I think you've covered it quite a bit. But in a nutshell, I was born in Tanzania. I lived in Malaysia at the age of 16 and then moved to Australia around 19-ish. And I feel like a lot of my critical thinking started when I left home, outside my bubble, just meeting different people in university and being kind of curious and... Sorry?
How was it back home? How was it back home when it comes to free thinking, when it comes to your opportunities as a woman?
So before I talk about how I was raised, let me tell you about a very recent incident that happened maybe 2 weeks ago.
Tell me.
There was a gay Muslim in Tanzania who was catfished via Tinder, and he was kidnapped and his body was cut into small pieces, obviously killed. So that's kind of like what Tanzania is like. Now, does this happen as often? No. But has it been quite hard for gay people? Yeah. And does it all obviously come from religion? Yes. But also it comes from being sub-Saharan African as well. Not having the general population as educated or open-minded. And I think over the years it's been, and maybe other African countries probably have seen it, but it's been more religious. So in short, a lot of African countries in the 80s started having a lot of like Muslim missionaries and imams coming and preaching and continuing, and a lot of countries started becoming more and more religious. You know, for me, the Iran Revolution was one part as well, because I grew up in a Shia community that worships Iran to date. You know, they can never see anything wrong in Iran. And as such, like when the Iran Revolution, the new revolution was happening, or the uprising was happening about 2 years ago, a lot of people, like my community, were one of the only communities outside Iran who had their own media broadcast supporting the Iran Revolution and calling all of the protesters liars and saying, oh, this has nothing to do with the hijab, women like the hijab, these are just spies. Literally, like everybody in Tanzania from my community, I want to say everybody, but like I'm sure like the younger people are a bit more skeptic. But a lot of people were very much like, yeah, this is, you know, foreign intervention, this is America, like very anti-America. And it kind of hit me that I was raised very much like that as well.
I was just about to say, it's absolutely fascinating to know this. I mean, for one thing, I've been following you kind of loosely, but like this is something I did not know about you, and I did not know about Tanzania, really. I have some experience with it in the Middle East. I mean, part of my family is Lebanese, and well, I was educated in like international institutions where had a lot of people like from Lebanon. I spent a lot of time in Lebanon, and I'm rather familiar with like Hezbollah, for example, which is very similar to what you're talking about. So the idea of an African Hezbollah, yeah, that's
Well, let
That's
me.
fascinating, and it's not something I really have experience with.
Yeah, well, maybe it would help if I again kind of give you a bit more, I want to say ancestry history that I only know very little of actually, which is a bit weird because I don't actually know my ethnicity besides what ancestry.com tells me. So ancestry.com tells me I'm Central Asian with a lot of Afghan, Pakistan, and then, 20% of that is Indian, while the 70 or like something, Afghan, and the other 10% is Yemen, Omani. So when the Oman War happened, a lot of them moved to Zanzibar, Tanzania. Basically, why this is important is my community is built on ethnic group and religious sect. So it's not one of the other. So Lebanese Shias would not really be attending our mosques because
Why not?
so our lectures were in Urdu or Gujarati or English, but they would feel very isolated. So I do know a lot of Lebanese, not a lot, some Lebanese Shias. Once or twice they've shown up in the mosque, but you can very easily call them out because they'll be sitting alone. They don't know people. It's like a club, right? So they're not really there. And even when we have some Iranians visiting, again, they're not really there because if they don't speak the language, the specific languages, like even if you speak Hindi, you might not speak Gujarati. Even if you speak Gujarati, you have to learn Hindi because those were the lecturers that were coming as I grew up. I had to learn Hindi or Urdu. So that way we were like our own exclusive group, which, kind of highlights a bit more about my situation in Tanzania because I think, Ben, we just spoke about it without, before the podcast, where other Shias would absolutely go ballistics with me being there. But this group was based on specific traits. Like I don't know a lot of people who were born in India and then moved to Tanzania. We've been there, like our group has been there for generations. So there are some people who move from India and, join our community, but we've been there for generations. So I was raised to have this kind of superiority, and not by my family per se, but it was a common thing. They were like, oh, not Pakistanis, not Indians, not Arabs, and not Iranians either. You have to be like a Khoja from East Africa, and then, people in the 80s and 70s moved to like the West, but they're still part of the community that moved. So
It's an isolated ethno-religious community, basically. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
About the African Hezbollah, do you think I'm off base there, or is that
Sorry, do you think there is
what I previously said about basically my first glance of what you described was basically the phrase African Hezbollah. Do you have an issue with that? Do you think that's problematic? Do you think that's
no, I mean African can
that's
do.
somewhat descriptive of that community?
I don't know. I don't think that's accurate though.
No.
Because like I was saying, like there's this distance between like Indians from India. Like we're Muslims, we like everybody, kind of, right? We don't like Pakistanis. They're very radical. We don't like most Arabs. We don't. When I was young, I didn't know the differences between like, Yemen having a different English and Arabic and Egypt and whatnot. And like some people also consider, some Yemenis don't consider, not Yemenis, but like Tunisians or Egyptians don't want to say they're Arabs, but they don't want, some people want to say Africans. And, there's this whole different, Arabs not wanting to be clustered in one. And when I was young, I didn't know that. So I was like, oh, but you're all Arabs anyway, you're the same. And like Pakistan and India were like, I knew they were a separate country and I knew like they have issues, but like I was like, but you're all the same. So you can understand how that's so confusing to my identity after leaving Islam, because now I'm no longer that religious part of this community at all, let alone understanding what my ethnicity actually is. So in that way, like me leaving Islam was also like a very big deal for my community because we're very tight knit, right? This isn't like just some, Hezbollah's, like one of the Hezbollah had a child, grandchild, whatnot, and then they leave Islam or whatnot. This was like tight knit. People know each other. to an extent that one of my friends, who's also an ex-Muslim in Toronto and does package deliveries, and he read somebody having the same legal surname as I do, and he's like, oh, I have a friend and she has the same surname and she's from Tanzania and her name is Zara. And she looked at her and like, oh, you're friends with Zara? I don't know this woman. I don't know this woman. She knows me. She knows my family. And I'm like, I don't know you. And like, that's how people know each other. So when I left, it was a big deal. That also means that my version of Islam was quite different to a lot of radicals. There were still some fundamental ideas, which is like hijab 5 times a day, prayers, cover yourself. You might want to wear like gloves covering half of your, palms, etc. A lot of patriarchal ideas like getting married, this is what you do for your husband, your father needs to give you permission to marry somebody, they have to choose. And a lot of it was, I want to say, cultural, but also religious cultural as well. It was a big gossip town. So when I did my first podcast, actually, I don't think I was fully prepared to kind of realize the consequences of it. And I was just excited to do a podcast and talk to somebody and be a bit public about it, just like a small bit. And it was just horrendous, the amount of hate I got. And I'm like, if I'm getting this much hate, surely there are other ex-Muslims who are getting a lot more. And, that's when Faithless Hijabi started. And I realized
in those, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I realized how good I had it. Yes, the hate won, but growing up, I was like, oh my God. Yes, I complained about a few things and I love my family to death and they're not perfect. But I was like, some brothers have raped their sisters. Some uncles have touched their nieces. I was just like, what the fuck? A lot of it was just surely it's not an Islamic thing that brothers rape or men rape, but it was very much tied into how women were objectified. Young girls were objectified.
Now, I'll tell you something else. Even in my own experience, let me say, a lot of people who I know from Saudi Arabia specifically, especially people who would be honest with me, and I do have a trustful relationship with, do have those kinds of non-consensual, incestual experiences. And it's not because Islam encourages incest, it's because there is this culture of protecting the tribe and honor and having accountability within this structure be somehow defamatory to the structure itself, or the community itself in a way. And so also, of course, you have the position that women are in, that is very, very commodified in the sense that, if you haven't had sex in your life, then you are like a new product. Where if you had sex in your life, then you're a used product. So you have a lower price. It is the case that certain people have this idea that if I do something to a family member, something there's not going to be accountability. I guess another factor might be the kind of isolation and sexual repression that some men might experience with that. There's also a separate topic. I mean,
but yeah, no,
it really only takes a few people within a community who are bad people to make it so that a lot of people are victimized. A few sociopaths can cause a lot of damage to a very large number of victims, and if the power structure is built as such as to stop accountability and not have people talk about those things, this thing is going to run rampant.
Yeah, I also think it has a lot to do with control, power, and then also raising the cycle of abuse as well, right? You're raising your sons to be the same as your brothers and their fathers as well, and that continues. And then you don't punish them because they're golden. It's your daughters that are now dirty. But a lot of these ideas, a lot of the stories that I had heard were just, I thought women were lying. I was like, surely that's not true. But then at the same time, I don't want to say I'm like I am an empathetic person, but I don't want to say that I live only being empathetic, because I had to put some boundaries with how I received people's stories as well. But when I was younger, I would cry every time I would see a story, and I'm like, I have to publish this, anonymize it, because the world needs to know. And there was so much overlap with women's struggles. And I think that's when it was like a true uprising for me, as not like, okay, this is no longer about me, my story. I mean, sure, it wasn't great for me, but there's so many women who are never going to be able to speak. And I don't want to be a voice for them, but I think it's important that people understand that there are so many people, so many women who are silenced. And when I was getting the hate for like me leaving, I feel like a lot of the people that were hating on me, who were Tanzanians, had no idea this other world even existed. The oppression of women, or like I said, during the current Masa Amini protests, a lot of Tanzanians, I can bet, will just say, no, this is all lies. Like, this is not true. And they would see it on social media and they were like, it's made up. They're actors, or it's just bad police, etc.
That sounds way too familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's such a common thread in authoritarian structures, right? In another show, we were talking with another activist from Iran, talking about how environmental activists, social justice activists are always considered to be spies. It's the same thing as, I believe, Ben, you made a comment about something in South America. I mean, in Russia, it's the exact same kind of situation. I do have connections in Russia. I know people in Russia, and of course, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, I mean, that was like
Such
that
an
was
easy way to dismiss disagreement, right?
yeah, exactly. And this is where, now when I look back at my past, like, I kept saying like, yeah, I had it good, but I'm reminded of all the terrible things that my brain had kind of removed from my memories, because, I think in some ways, a lot of people would tell me I'm lucky to have an education, to, have work, whatnot. But at the same time, in my head, I was comparing my situation to other people who've had it worse, to a point that I didn't even hold people or situations accountable for the bad that happened. So this story about this gay guy who was chopped up, and it might be one of the millions that it would happen to, but at the same time, it's not just an isolated incident. A lot goes into this final result. There's a lot of women who are abused. There's a lot of women who have never thought their life beyond a husband, or a husband is possible. A lot of my friends got married between 18 to 20. Maybe less than 10% even have degrees, or at least have degrees before they got married. And a lot of times, like, I didn't even know that my peers, like when I was 16, that they could potentially be forced to marry, because they were like, oh yeah, I'm getting married. And I'm like, we just graduated. Like, what do you mean you're getting married? He's like, yeah, my dad found me and I didn't realize those were forced marriages. Because it didn't happen to me, in my head, it just meant that nobody else goes through it. And, in that light, I still say that, I come from a conservative, like, community, and fundamentalist in some ways, but it's not as bad as like places in Pakistan, maybe, and places in Saudi. But I also think there are a lot of people in Saudi who potentially don't have to go through forced marriage as well. And I think we need to recognize the little privilege that, we all have, and try to do better to break what is not an option for many women.
I think you're touching on a very important point, which is that a lot of Muslims, a lot of people from Muslim communities tend to go into defense mode when we talk about those issues like forced marriage, when we talk about issues like forced veiling or whatever. I mean, a lot of social issues, yeah, they are not at the same level of problematic in all Muslim communities, yeah, and so if you are living in a family where there are no forced marriages, and you hear people like ex-Muslims, like in the West or whatever, like talking about this problem, yeah, there are people experiencing that. There are people suffering immensely because of that. Their immediate response is basically to go, no, this is not a part of Islam. We actually don't have that. I don't experience that. Yeah, there are isolated instances of people, yeah, kind of taking advantage of bad situations and so on. Yeah, and I mean, one
And
part of it is they want to defend a kind of worldview that they have that this has absolutely nothing to do with Islam without first really having a clear definition that the rest of the world kind of understands of what Islam is. Just because the version of Islam that exists in your mind does not have forced marriage, does not mean that prevalent conceptions of Islam around the world don't have this problem, and that we don't need to take active action against it.
yeah, exactly. I feel like we have that so many times that, I kind of understand where these people are coming from, but it's based on so much ignorance as well. Because we're trying to, I guess they're trying to here defend the whole faith as though they own it, but they're only then reflecting on their experiences as well. But I feel like that's how a lot of us see the world anyway. I guess our experience here was that our experience in this podcast is that we've known people who've gone through certain things and certain so we've seen that a lot of people have been oppressed or oppressed because of religion, and that makes us have this viewpoint of like doing this podcast and talking about it. And it kind of then makes me realize that if you've been through that experience, or if you've known that experience, how do you still how do you still ignore it? So even when you put evidence in front of a lot of Muslims as well, you still tend to go like, no, this isn't true, this is lies. Or when we quote the Quran, it's like, oh, but you're not interpreting it correctly, it's scripture, sorry, it's interpretation, it's language, etc. To a point that I think no matter what evidence is put forward, if they're not willing to take that in, sometimes there's no point. As much as you can yell, if they're not there to take that in and change their mind, it becomes quite harder to put a point forward or change their mind in that case. I wasn't sure where I was going with that. I think it was just like,
I think this point of theology and the meaning of scripture and that kind of thing is more or less like constantly evolving. I kind of have a different take on it every couple of weeks. Yeah, but basically, where I'm at now is that it's not very important how we interpret the text, what the classical and mainstream interpretation of the text is. Basically, what the individual person that we're talking to interprets the text as. Let me give you an example. Take into consideration that there is a small minority of Muslims that would interpret the passage in the Quran that says "beat your wives," basically, to reinterpret the word "beat" like in a different way, which in the Arabic language doesn't make sense, but like in a more metaphorical way, like like hitting the road, or there's a metaphor in Arabic like hitting an example, like giving an example for something, or abstaining from something that like striking, basically. Yeah. So strike them basically doesn't mean use violence against them. It means it's like a food strike, like sex strike, basically. It's like strike from them and don't have contact with them. And so that makes absolutely no linguistic sense or dialectically or whatever, but fine. I mean, if this is how you want to understand it and this is how you want to build your life around this text, then that you think people shouldn't be using violence against women in this way.
I think that has certainly made me, like, I want to say, more tolerant of Muslim apologists as well. And I think it's just made me realize that it's not up to me to change your mind. I know people say, but
It's,
that's why you're an activist. And I'm like, yeah, there's
it's
information
like,
out there.
basically
Like,
what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm feeling like, you know, I want to complete the point that with the thought that just came to me, which is basically that sex means to you what it means to you, and if through that, you know, it doesn't cause you to cause harm, then I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. I know I have a lot of trolls that come on my page and they're like, oh, look at how many Muslims like, you know, how many people are converting to Islam. The number of Muslims is growing. And I'm like, I don't care. I honestly do not care. I remember when I was younger, when I just left, I was like, no, this is not true. It's conversions. I'm like, you know what? I don't really care. If people want to convert, they should do it.
It
But at the same time, within this context, your understanding of that and you're giving credence to that text as being holy or whatever. Okay, I don't care about that per se. But when I or you or some other person in public takes action and speaks out against people who are understanding in the way that, yes, use violence against women and beat your wives and so on, then I will not accept your response basically being defensive of, no, you're being like, you're misrepresenting, you're lying, this, you know, this isn't what it really means. And no, you should stand with me. I mean, if this is the way you understand it, fine, let's work together in order to to fight against the people who understand it in the harmful way.
I think so. I mean, I guess I think you have a bit more patience than I do in that matter, because I feel like I'm at a point where I'm not willing to debate a lot. I'm not willing to debate a lot of Muslims, actually. I think it takes a lot more energy out of me than it gives me energy, actually. But or also, like, I also think that some people are likely not going to change their mind when they come in with the intention of debating versus discussion. So it really depends on how the person kind of approaches or how they perceive things. Because I've actually had Muslims or even ex-Muslims who have come up to me and they're like, I want to be public about it, or like, how do I leave Islam? And I'm like, I think, like, for ex-Muslim, like, I think this is your journey. Like, you should think about what your reasons are, etc. There's nothing me or another ex-Muslim can tell you that will be satisfactory, because then you're depending on us for your thinking as well.
No, I'm completely with you on this point. I mean, I'm not a big fan of polemics and that kind of thing. The kind of setup where you have basically those discussions set up as you have basically, like, you have this defense attorney for God and you have this prosecutor, and each one's job is to kind of represent a specific position and not give credit to the other position. Maybe it might be justified, right?
I think I'm more willing to talk to people when they come in with a more curious mind versus like, you're wrong, or like, debate.
I mean, very counterintuitively, something that a lot of people would not expect from the title of the book I'm about to mention. But I read a book by Peter Boghossian called A Manual to Creating Atheists, which gave me a kind of perspective that I didn't necessarily have before. That was a long time ago. It was years ago now. About basically, if you want to have an effective conversation with someone and have any hope of really convincing them of your position, you need to take the journey with them and not clash heads with them. You need to basically go with them. Okay, so why do you believe that it is the case that this needs a design? Or why do you believe that it is the case that Jesus sacrificed himself for the sins of the world? Or whatever it is, yeah? try to go with them and really empathize with the cognitive process that they have in reaching the conclusion that they reach. I mean, it might lead to you agreeing with them if they have good enough reasons. In my experience with religious people, it's like it generally goes the way that they kind of come to the idea of kind of conclusion that I don't necessarily have the necessary kind of consequential evidence to lead me to that in one way or another. I mean, there's many things that I'm not convinced of, but I mean, it's a good way to learn and kind of teach other people. This is the endeavor of the exchange of ideas.
I do think though a lot of I do disagree with many ex-Muslims who kind of, including myself, who kind of go in with the approach of proving the other person wrong or taking it upon themselves to convert people to
Yeah.
a certain. I feel like I'm doing all their thinking, or I'm trying to in some way validate how I'm feeling or my journey. When I was quite new, and maybe for a few years, maybe for many years then as well, I felt the need to do that. That, I'm like, if this person understands, they'll see where I'm coming from. And now it's simply, I don't care enough. I don't
Yeah.
care
And
enough
also,
in the
yeah,
sense that, you know, you think about people like Ali Dawa and Muhammad Hijab, etc. People who can read are also a bit stupid as well sometimes.
I mean, people like Ali Dawa or Muhammad Hijab. I mean, recently I've been creating like memes and content about this. Like, there's this Saudi religious preacher called Planet Khamis, who is like so incredibly stupid. He's like going on a rant about how it's forbidden to read philosophy and atheist books, and then going on, okay, if you want to really convince an atheist about God existing, just ask them who created the world, who created this or that, and who created you. Like Abraham said in the Quran, if God brings the sun from the east, then try to bring it from the west. Yeah, see how that works out for you. And,
Yeah, but like exactly
like the circular reasoning and logical fallacies are going into each other in such like compounded ways. It's absolutely insane, and it's not like even about people being uneducated. I would never mock somebody just for being uneducated or having low intelligence. Yeah, that's just how the conditions of the world brought them to be. But I would mock people for basically being proud of that and resisting knowledge at any cost. No, do not read. Do not expand your horizons. Do not think. Do not. You have this willing knowledge. You have this like this willing ignorance, basically. Yeah,
yeah.
it's at that point I'm like, the only way to really engage with you is mockery. I mean, I would never have a debate with somebody like Ali Dawa or Mohammed Hijab. I mean, the only way I would possibly ever engage with them is mockery. Honestly, I mean, there is no other way to engage with them. And honestly, I mean, they don't engage in honest discussion, intellectual
Exactly.
discussion either.
And I think
I mean, as
it's
far as I have experience with, like, for example, Saudi religious leaders and sheikhs and so on, it's like those people. I mean, maybe it's more true in Saudi Arabia in those contexts. They say things that are very stupid, and nobody has the courage to laugh in their face or tell them that they're wrong, because the stupid things that they're saying entail basically threats. Yeah, if you disagree with me, we're going to kill you. And so, honestly, the only response to this kind of attitudes to go about those intellectual discussions is to show how the way that they're thinking and make fun of them, and that's it, and then just let it go.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, there's the Ali Dawa gang and co, and then there's also some people who are maybe likely to agree with you that Islam doesn't have the best of morals or rules, but also find themselves spiritually connected to the concept of God anyway. and that in this case they would rather prefer being religious, like they would rather prefer being Muslims in the sense of like spiritual connection to God versus a dogmatic belief. And that's where like I've become a bit more sensitive, not sensitive, but more, I don't want to say tolerant, accepting of those views as well, because I'm like, again, like you're entitled to believe in what you want to. Like the idea of God never made sense to me. So when I left,
Never.
well, in my adult life, like I want to say in my adult life, because I remember praying to God. I remember doing it before my exams. I remember going through heartbreak or wanting something or feeling
When did
sad.
that change?
I don't
What
know
was the
exactly.
breaking point there?
So I don't know exactly.
So there
But
wasn't a clear point where you kind of made the
no,
decision that, no, this actually doesn't make sense at all.
no. I mean, there was a point actually. There was a point, but it was more about the homophobia in Islam that made it easier for me to leave Islam. But I wasn't overly attached to the idea of God. So when I made that decision during that period in, I think it was about 2017, yeah. So when I made that decision, it was easier for me to just go like, I'm an atheist, than it was for me to actually make that first decision to go like, I don't believe in Islam anymore. And I realized that what was tying me or what was keeping me close to God was Islam. So when I took all of that out, what I had was, again, everything that I was told from a young age, but nothing that was proven or nothing that made, concrete sense to me or that was evidence-based. So when I left, I was like, well, obviously, like I'm looking at how Islam is terrible for women, for gay people. You look at historical events, and I wasn't very well versed at all at the time. But I was like, as the more I kept reading, the more I was scrolling through XMNA, or when I was like, okay, what is the verse that on hijab, or like what is the verse about women, and then you read all of this, and you're like, oh, I didn't know any of it when I was a Muslim. I didn't know any of that. I knew very bits and pieces, all the verses that I knew about, like everything that I was praying, everything that I was saying while praying, one Arabic. But when you translate it, everything had to do with submission to God, God being merciful, God being this, 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 this. But then at the same time, there was this idea that God is divine as well. And I'm like, but there's so much shit happening in the world. Like, if people who believe God is divine end up committing the most horrendous crime and excusing that God has said X, Y, Z, that I don't want this God, because that's the God people have shown me. And that in that sense, then, because there is no evidence for God, I can't just make him up in my head and just go like, oh, but some God may exist, and that is the God I believe in. So I think for me, it was easier to just not believe in God than to start thinking about, oh, but maybe it's the wrong God. Because there were so many scriptural overlap with Christianity, for instance. And then with Buddhism, I was like, okay, but maybe it's not too bad with Buddhism. But then you look at how the violent ideas that some Buddhists have, which is,
Yeah, go on.
which is like, do bad for the short term, but as long as it's good for the long term. So you're like, and that's how they were killing a lot of Uyghur Muslims as well. And there was this idea. And then I'm like, okay, well, sure, Buddhism as a concept makes sense, but there's a lot of spiritual connection that I do not feel. So
In
even though I
defense of
liked,
Buddhism,
parts of it, go for it.
in defense of Buddhism, the violence in Myanmar, sure, there are monks supporting it, but about 20 years ago, the junta killed off all the monks in charge when they started protesting, and then replaced them with their own people. So I don't know if you can really truly call them monks who are supporting the violence now. Not that Buddhism doesn't rapidly lose its appeal when you live in a Buddhist place, from what I hear.
So as I was saying, I like the idea of Buddhism, but then religion means nothing if people weren't practicing, or like if there weren't a group of people. Like it would be obsolete if there weren't a group of people believing in that religion. Like that's what gives ideas life. And for me, like, yes, the situation in Myanmar was not appealing, but at the same time, like, I couldn't feel that spiritual connection with a supernatural entity.
By the way, we do have an episode with a guest from the Rohingya Muslim community who does talk about the struggles like that this minority struggles with. So if you're listening, do check it out. Yeah, go on.
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, but that was kind of it. I think for me, it was like, it was in 2017, about maybe 9 years after I'd lived away from home, that it actually, broke down to me. And it had a lot to do with a particular incident about homophobia within my community in Canada, actually. But because, like I said, the community is extended to people traveling or have traveled and lived abroad, and people know each other, it affected me because I was vocal about defending the right of people to love who they want to. And the attacks I got was crazy. To that point, I then started looking, what are the verses in the Quran that talk about peace between Muslims when you don't agree? Like, it's okay to disagree. Like, you can have different versions of Islam. And, well, I found none. But
there's a hadith that says, I don't know if it's a thing in Shia Islam as well, but like growing up, it was like basically says that the Muslim Ummah is going to divide in over 70 different sects, and only one of them is going to heaven. Everyone else was going to hell.
Yeah, we had that, and we thought the Shias were the right sect, and we're like, of course we're the right sect. Like,
actually, we were the right sect.
Yeah, sure.
So you were wrong.
I mean, Sunnis and other non-Muslims as well will probably go to hell. Anyway, but yeah, no, there were things like this. But then I thought at the core of, Islam, like many other Muslims think, there's peace, right? Like, it's a peaceful religion. I didn't think about the word peaceful in my head when I was doing that. But I was like, at the core of it, we are all Muslims, right? Because, maybe 5 or 7, 5 years before then anyway, like before the 2017 incident, I was always like, I'm not a Shia, I'm not a Sunni, I'm a Muslim. So had my own version of God, I guess I had my own version of Allah, which was like, I don't have to pray 5 times a day as long as I'm not a bad person. God knows that I don't want to do the Allahu Akbar every time. And I'll be fine. And I never really prayed as much. So, not living next to my family who were enforcing it gave me a bit more freedom to create this own bubble for myself, do everything I wanted to do in like moderation. So I'd never had alcohol or anything like that. But like removing the hijab, for instance. So I guess, years before me being an ex-Muslim or like announcing that I was an ex-Muslim, I probably had like a very different version of Islam than many people would actually think. So I would still go to bars with my friends and I wouldn't drink. I was like, I'm just going to have water. I would never buy drinks. I would never spend money on alcohol because, in my head, it's like, it's haram money, so I'm never going to do that. So it was a bit weird. But I think because I didn't have my family, the only person, enforcing these things were me. And that meant that I had to still be a good Muslim in that way, like my inner jihad, and try to still battle off ideas like that. But that also made it easier for me to leave then, because I wasn't going to, I think in my head, lose out much, because I was not around a Muslim community in Australia. I didn't think the Muslim friends I had would actually stop being friends with me. Like, that was a surprise. And that was probably like, hello, like, I was the one who would commit no sins, and you guys would be sinning or have boyfriends. And I was like, yeah, no, it's haram. And then somehow I leave Islam and you're like, oh my God, but you're going to go to hell. It was a bit crazy.
It's very unexpected, no?
Yeah. I have to go. I'm wondering if you have final questions.
Wanted to mention Faithless Hijabi. You do a lot of good work there.
Oh, thank you.
I would like you to elaborate on that a little bit more. I mean, both myself and you have been in contact with individuals who have struggled with issues like force veiling and and I can say like from I guess secondhand personal experience that you have been an immense help for a lot of people who are dealing with issues like that, and within such situations might be alone, right? And so I think it is an incredibly important endeavor. Yeah, ex-Muslims, girls, people who feel alone in their struggles and their experiences, and thus far,
Yeah, maybe I
I
can.
hope you wouldn't mind my recommending reaching out to Faithless Hijabi and bothering you and
No,
taking up your
absolutely. I
important
mean,
time and so far. Very important work, psychological support, like just talking to people. I mean, I've actually like worked with Zara with individuals who had to leave very precarious situations, and so saying this from the heart here.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, we started Faithless Hijabi as a storytelling platform when I was leaving, when I'd left Islam, actually.
Just
And
like this platform.
yeah, exactly. Like bringing people's voices out there. And during COVID, when, mental health was popularized online and accepted more so, we kind of wanted to take that model and apply it to Faithless Hijabi, where we're like, okay, look, we're not licensed therapists. We cannot talk to like 100 people every day and support them because we all obviously have our day jobs or are studying, etc. And we have a lot of people that are at the verge of suicide or just need to talk to somebody or need preventative therapy. And that's when we took the COVID kind of model and applied it to Faithless Hijabi, where, we found a handful of therapists who were going to do, therapy sessions for a very reduced cost. And, then we're like, okay, well, if people donate, we can provide therapy. And we've done the heavy lifting where we've found therapists. The therapists do it on pro bono, like they charge about 2 or 3 times more than they charge us just for, 12 sessions. And people who can't afford it can now access therapy and now
Yeah.
support as well.
Now let me interject here. So on the point of therapy and mental health, this is so incredibly important. I have been active and looking into communities and pages online of ex-Muslims within the Middle East, within their Arab world. And I have been seeing some concerning stuff and kind of questions and things of things like, guys, do you know a therapist, a mental health professional, a psychiatrist that doesn't have a problem with atheists and won't report me to the government? That kind of thing. You never know. I do know a guy from Saudi Arabia, a transgender man who told this to his therapist in confidence, and his therapist brought like religious police in Saudi Arabia there to basically prosecute him for his identity. Seeking mental health support as an ex-Muslim, as an LGBT person, as a woman who wants to be free, or as a person who does not fit the mold that the fundamentalist conception of religion that the state imposes on you has in those contexts. It is incredibly difficult to find this kind of support, and so those services are vital. And yeah, so donations, things like that would be important. And this does remind me actually to I should probably reach out to one or two people on some like online communities who have posed questions like that I haven't really answered because my mind was somewhere else at that point. And now that you mention it, contact Faithless Hijabi, contact people who are motivated to provide the support. If you are in a more safe and well-off situation, then do consider donating. It would be incredibly helpful. On that note, we are going to talk to Jimmy Bangash on an upcoming episode of this podcast. Who is a licensed therapist, mental health professional, who also talks to struggling former Muslims, LGBT people, and people who do not fit the mold of the theocratic establishment in certain Middle Eastern countries. So
Yeah, I
do
really
stay
like.
tuned for that. This is very important. Yeah. Go on.
I was just going to say, I really like Jimmy, so I'm glad. I know you'll have a really good podcast with him anyway. But yeah,
Yes.
no, I think the
Um,
therapy sessions are really important for a lot of people who need to talk to somebody. But also, I think when you grow up with cultures like we have, you're not really, mental health is stigmatized, right? And you also run at the risk of religious conversion or gay conversion therapy in those countries as well. And that makes it
Absolutely.
really unsafe, but also like this is a person's life who can be completely fucked if you start, converting them to like Islam or threatening them or like putting ideas and making them feel unsafe in something that, is very vulnerable to them. But yes, please donate. We're doing amazing work. Sign up to our newsletter on the website and refer all your friends and people who are ex-Muslims, not only women, but also men who need support. And
Absolutely. On a different note, I have been thinking lately that, well, we talk about a lot of very difficult issues, a lot of human rights abuses, about a lot of depressing things. And we have joked before, that this is because we're kind of masochistic in that sense, and we don't like to have fun. But maybe we should lighten us up a little bit and add a little bit of humor, comedy here. And I would like to ask you in that line of thought, which is it true that Shias consider rabbits to be insects?
no.
You never heard that?
No. What?
So,
We had rabbits at home.
are you allowed to eat rabbits?
We never ate them. We named them.
Is it haram to eat rabbits?
No. I mean,
No?
I've eaten
Really?
everything. Maybe.
Interesting.
I don't know if I ate
Yeah, because here's the thing, like Sunnis eat rabbits. Shias, as far as like in Iraq and Saudi Arabia go, and like the people I know from those regions, have said to me, Shias have like different hadiths and traditions. They're like, I guess, more strict, kind of like Orthodox, like conservative Jews. They have problems with shellfish and stuff.
Mm.
I have been coming across those videos. I mean, I've been sharing this video around nonstop because I find it endlessly hilarious. There's this like Shia cleric, this Iraqi guy, like kind of talking, so self-important, so taking himself so seriously, and like he's the king of the world, and the eating of rabbit flesh is forbidden, and the reason for that is that rabbits are among the insects, and insects are generally forbidden in Islam. You've never come across that. I'm surprised by that, but anyway,
No, I've never.
I thought it was an opportunity to have a little bit of lightheartedness on this podcast.
I mean, I know
In
rabbits
any
are
case,
okay.
since you do have to leave soon, is there something that we haven't mentioned that you think is important to mention? Something that I didn't ask you that you think maybe would be better if I did ask you, would benefit the audience more if I had asked you? Yeah, the mic is yours.
Nothing I can think of. No, nothing I can think of really. I guess Israel and Palestine is quite trending for a long time now.
Yes, I think you might be the person who has like the most similar kind of take on the thingy as I do, that I kind of see on the sphere, because it's so incredibly polarized, right? You like political groups that I'm involved with, on everyone. I'm frustrated with everybody. You have the more pro-Palestine solidarity people, stop genocide in Gaza, no more violence, no more actions of war, no more this and that, and and leave them alone completely. And then the Israelis, the terrorists against the settlers. Israel bears absolutely no responsibility in any part of this conflict whatsoever, and it's just so exhausting. I'm tired of it. It's like, I don't think I've ever heard this position before, and I don't even know if I've expressed it in public before. But basically, like, it's either boycott Israel, stop any country from supporting it, never support Israel, stop the war, ceasefire, so on, or it's support Israel in everything. My position about supporting the war and so on, I think the West should support Israel. I think the United States, Germany, Europe, we should support them in the endeavor of defending themselves against Hamas. Yeah, deconstructing Hamas in Gaza and making sure that something like the attacks of October 7th do not happen again. But we also need to put some pressure and make this kind of support conditional.
No.
Don't expand settlements in the West Bank, right? Don't use chemical weapons against civilians. That kind of thing. Don't tolerate government officials using genocidal rhetoric, like referring to Gazans as human animals. Don't have people in government who advocate for turning this thousands-year-old city into a parking lot. This is not acceptable, and as long as this is the case, we probably shouldn't be supporting Israel. Like those conditions should be like a strategy of pressure that is plausibly effective, so that Israel does shift to a point that is more reasonable, so that we can support them in defending themselves against terrorism, and making sure that something like the attacks of October 7th do not happen again.
Yeah, are you done?
I have a somewhat less nuanced idea. This point, cover the whole thing in 50 meters of salt.
Sorry?
Cover the whole place in 50 meters of salt. No one can fight over it then.
I do think even amongst ex-Muslims, a lot of this has been so black and white, which like baffles me, right? And I particularly, like, I was talking to a few of my friends, or like we did a podcast with Susanna and Luai as well. And obviously Luai is quite pro-Israeli, and I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I don't want those to be the option. So whenever I talk to Luai, I come up as like very anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. And then whenever I talk to some Palestinian supporter, they're like, you're pro-genocide. And I'm like, I don't give a shit. Anyway, but I think
I get the same feeling, yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like it's so, like, what we were discussing in that podcast was that, a lot, the anti-Israel sentiments are very, very popular across ex-Muslim Arabs more than others. And I wonder if it's because they've lived a bit more in the surrounding regions. And I think it's quite crazy that like these are the only options, as though I feel like a lot of people have boxed themselves and they don't want to think about it anymore. And they're like, it's easier to blame one or the other. I do think that there's a lot of blame to be pointed towards Israel, and a lot of blame pointed towards Hamas as well. But I think I'm willing to be corrected here that a lot of people want to think that Palestinians do not like Hamas. Like, the majority of Palestinians don't like Hamas. But I'm coming from the position where I'm like, I can understand the Palestinians who support Hamas. I'm not saying I support them, but I can understand when you grow up around it, you're filled with that hate, and all you're going to do is vote for Hamas. But I also understand that there are people who are completely in opposition. I just don't think that the majority of Palestinians are in opposition with Hamas.
I think for me, it's somewhat has to do with a deterministic kind of philosophical position on human behavior, which is like those things are. It's a point that I wanted to mention before about rising religiosity in developing nations that are uneducated, and the correlation with lack of education and that kind of thing. Is it that religion causes social ills and lack of education, or is it that social ills and lack of education, is it that religion is a symptom of those things? I mean, I think on a certain level both are kind of true, yeah. And it is complicated, but I mean, I hope I'm being somewhat clear in what I'm trying to express, basically, that the situation of lack of education, lack of resources, and so on is very nurturing to extremist attitudes when it comes to religion and politics, things like that. Yeah, I suppose the point I'm making in a roundabout way is kind of the same point that you're making. I'm just realizing that. Yeah.
All good. But
in the case of Israel and Palestine, there are literally too many bad actors to list them in a reasonable amount of time. One that nobody seems to mention, but that really grinds my gears as an American, are the American Christian Zionists who want all the Jews to go to Israel to help Armageddon or something.
I think it's just crazy how the world has become so vile. So vile, both sides, really. It's like calling Palestinians all terrorists and then calling Israeli all genocide supporters, or people who are pro-genocide. And like, I've been to Israel, and I have to say that I liked Israel. I did not like how rude people were in Israel. I guess they weren't rude, they're just very blunt. And I thought it had to do with like my name or my race, but you know what? I looked like everybody else. Nobody cared about my name. Like, I was in a shop and somebody just was very like not giving me attention. So, after I left, I was just observing this person, and she was the same thing to others, did the same thing to other Israeli. And I'm like, oh, I went to Israel with this bias that Jews hate me. For some reason, it's written on my forehead. But that was not the case. It was still really nice. Whenever I tried bringing up the topic about like Israel and Palestine, most people in Israel were like, we don't want the war. Like, we don't want to. And I'm not saying that I talked to like 5 people. I talked to a lot of people. Like, I was there to go like, yeah, you should recognize this is stolen land. But they were like, no, we don't want the war. We just want to live in peace. There were only a handful who were very mad at me for saying I had a really good trip in Israel slash Palestine, because it was in a group chat, or like in a group, like a Google group. And they're like, there's no Israel slash Palestine. It's just Israel. Like 3 or 4 people that were really mad. And what happened was a lot of their colleagues apologized to me because they realized how crazy they were being, like those people, to somebody who isn't from here and was saying good things about here. And they were like, what the fuck, like they shouldn't have spoken to you this way. So I think like it's very hard for me to believe that even the videos that I see online about Israelis or Palestinians hating the other so blatantly, it's a bit it's a bit hard for me to go like, oh, these are the same. I talk to a lot of people, but obviously not every person. And also, these are people who are brought up like that. These are people who are like, from a young age, brought up to think like that, continue like that. And then obviously October 7th happens and it just gets worse. Like I said, I wouldn't, like I said, like I can understand how some Palestinians find Hamas appealing. I can also understand how some Israelis find killing Palestinians appealing as well. Like, it's the same thing. You're both, soaking in the hate because that's all you've known, because that's where your anger comes from, not from a rational place anyway.
I mean, if there's a facet to this whole, I don't know, I maybe a little bit less structured and organized than I imagined it to be, but also more heartful and spontaneous in a sense. If I am to draw a general like kind of facet, like those desperate topics, I would say is basically just the goal that we're striving towards, the most basic prerequisite for prosperity and peace and human dignity. We need to recognize each other's humanity and stop putting each other into boxes, into like and assigning attributes of virtues and vices and like blames to entire nations and ethnicities and poorly defined religious group. We need to talk to each other more and understand each other's perspectives and see each other's humanity. And as long as somebody doesn't want me dead, as long as somebody is not making an active effort to take away my rights, I try to be as open as possible, even to people who are, I suppose, in theory might be Islamists and believe in certain principles, but don't, I guess, pose a danger to me that I find plausible. And I hope people take something valuable from this discussion.
Yeah.
I have said my closing words. Zara has said her closing words, as far as I can tell. To correct me if I'm wrong. Ben, do you have anything to say before we sign out and say goodbye?
Yeah, just like to recognize Zara and Faithless Hijabi as being some of the few people who are reducing the chaos that we're all stuck in these days, and helping people handle the effects of the ever rising chaos levels. And I think somebody agrees with me. Little divine trickster.
Wonderful. All right then. So, Zara Kay, thanks so much for joining us. It was an honor talking to you, and to our audience. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you've taken something out of this. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, your night. Take care of yourself. Stay healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.